happen to your thinking in those few seconds. I want to get very personal with you today. I want to talk about you and this system up here that we kind of take for granted, but is so critical to everything that we do. This morning, sitting at my table with my table mates, we were talking about this idea of thinking agility, and they said, you know we need it, but how do you get it? So I'll share with you today 4 steps that you'll be able to immediately use to better increase your thinking agility. But first, let me ask you a question. How much time in the last week did you spend doing email? What do you think? What would you guess that would be? I'm hearing 10, 20. The average is 13 hours a week. 13 hours a week. When you do the math, that adds up to almost 1 month of 24-hour days, 3 months of 8-hour work days a year. And some of you are saying, oh, no, I do much more than that. It's 4 months. Now, let me ask you this. How much time in the last week did you spend thinking about your thinking and where you want to be in the future? Zippo. Probably none. Most people say to me, well, not really. And when I ask why, they say, I didn't have the time. I was too busy doing email, obviously. Or maybe doing those other things that they're now calling screen sucking, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. So why is this important? I was able to meet Liz Wiseman last week, the author of Multiplier, and she describes today's environment in an interesting way. She says it's vast, fast, and fleeting. Can you relate to that? Vast amounts of data that we're getting almost every second. Fast, things moving at a pace of unprecedented change. And then fleeting, the shelf life of information is so short, by the time it hits our inbox, it's almost obsolete. And in the future, it's just going to get worse. You know, the U.S. Army War College was asked to predict the future some years ago, and they came up with an acronym that maybe you've heard of, VUCA. Although it sounds a bit Klingon, it's actually quite useful. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Does that describe your world? And this vast, fast, and fleeting VUCA world does some crazy things to us. It means that we're reacting rather than thinking ahead. So we might do some really crazy things. You might find yourself asking this particular question. And if we can get this to advance. So, Jim, where do you see yourself in the next 10 minutes? And so as we're looking at this, what is the antidote to VUCA? The antidote to VUCA is to be very deliberate in planning ahead to prepare for the environment that we'll face. I believe that we all, and those that we lead, need to step up and lead ourselves so that, this crazy, swirling world of change and technology doesn't lead us. And that is what thinking agility is all about. The definition of thinking agility is pretty straightforward. It's the ability to consciously and deliberately, and those 2 words are really important, shift your thinking when and as the situation requires it. And you experience that all the time. But part of what the VUCA environment requires is that we learn more about the system. So step 1 is just understand what it is that's happening in your head. Get to know your brain better. And I know that firsthand. I grew up with a father who was doing brain research. So I used to come home after school and get wired up to the EEG for testing, bring my friends over. Some people say that explains how I turned out. I don't know. For you to judge. Well, we learned some interesting things. One of the things that we learned is that you can shift your thinking. And, you just did that earlier, hopefully with that little musical exercise. But let me invite you to do another quick activity. Take a look at the screen, and whatever it is that you paid attention to first, either the profile or the person facing you, shift to the other view. Okay? So it's very easy to do that, but it requires intention and energy to do that. Right? So we can all shift our thinking. That's something that we can all do. The other thing that we learned that was really fascinating is that we function on autopilot most of the time. How many of you have been driving home at some point and you can't remember the last 20 minutes of your drive? You kind of wonder how you got there, right? So the reason this happens is our brain is like a pattern-seeking machine. It's constantly looking for patterns. And once we've learned something, we figure that's enough and we're efficient, and we can just stop there. And that can be very useful. So language is an important pattern. So can you read this, for example? What does that say? Amazing that we could read it, right? And pretty creative way to do that sign, right, to send that message. Okay, so language is a great example of patterning, and you think, okay, that works really well. Let me see if you can read. What does this say? Good times are here. And you're pretty sure that that's what it says, right? Aha. All right. So here's the challenge with patterns. Patterns can be wrong. And so our brain thinks something is going to happen, and in fact, sometimes it doesn't happen that way. So we've learned a lot about our patterning. And one of the things that we know is that the patterning is there for all of us. And by being aware of it, you can better manage it and control it. And so let's talk about some of the patterns that we know about. We know that the brain is highly specialized. We heard Eric talk about left brain, right brain a little bit earlier. And one of the things that we've learned through our research is that the brain is whole. It's highly integrated, so we don't want to be separating it into parts. But there are 4 thinking clusters, specialized clusters of thinking, that are very useful for you to think about in terms of your own thinking patterns and those that you work with. And those 4 are pretty easy to describe if you think about whole brain thinking. It's analytical thinking. And how many of you feel that you have a pretty strong preference for analytical thinking? You might raise your hand. Practical thinking. Some of you might feel like that's where you like to live. Relational thinking. How many of you feel that that's pretty strong for you? Or experimental thinking. And each of those has a really strong focus towards payoff, process, people, or possibilities. But this all sounds really kind of interesting as a concept. Let me tell you a story that kind of brings it to life in terms of what agile thinking means, because it means your ability to seamlessly move across all 4 of these. I knew an executive at GE, and this executive, he was actually a physicist by training, but he was head of management education at Crotonville, up at the corporate university of GE, and he found himself bedridden due to an illness, and just out of sheer boredom, he took up painting. Seems to be a theme today, right? So he took up painting, and he actually discovered he was pretty good. And the more he did it, the more he realized that he had this untapped creative potential, and that that's really what he wanted to be doing for the rest of his life. Did he really want to just be an executive for the rest of his life, or did he want to pursue this passion that he discovered? And so he started to dream about the possibilities, up there in the yellow. And he used a mind hack, and I like mind hacks because they help us kind of help our brains lock into what it is that we're trying to do. And his mind hack was to take a 8.5 by 11 piece of notebook paper, and up in the upper right-hand corner, he thought 10 years out, and he started to describe and create a picture in his mind of what that future could be like for him. What did it actually look like? And he got really excited about it. So let me ask you, when was the last time you thought about your possibilities? Where you want to be in 10 years? You'll blink and you'll be there. Have you experienced that in the last decade? Absolutely. So what would that look like for you? But then, of course, you have to kind of go back, and he said, well, okay, now I have to get real. How am I going to pay for this? Going from an executive to a full-time artist? Oh, okay. So we worked backwards from that end view and established the goals that he needed to achieve. How many paintings would he need to sell? How many would he need to paint? What would he need to do by when in order to make this transition happen? And so you might think about what it is that you would need to do. What goals would you need to engage in to actually take those next steps? What analysis would you need to do in order to make that happen? But then you sort of say, okay, where do I start, right? That's a tricky part. So getting really practical, it was like, okay, so what processes can I put in place that will allow me to achieve those goals? And so he decided that he would paint every evening after work. And he did, every single evening after work. He ended up doing over 600 paintings in the course of his career. And then he decided he would join the local art association so he'd learn about the business of art. And finally, he found, he decided that he would put in place some very specific steps so that he knew that he would keep on keeping on with this painting so that he could actually get there. So what steps might you need to take practically to actually move into that future? But last but not least, there was somebody really important, his wife and his family. They kind of needed to buy into this decision, right? Kind of a major career change. And interestingly enough, the people around us are really important. And he was actually able to get his boss at GE to sponsor several art shows at Crotonville. And interestingly enough, they actually closed a big client deal because the client was really interested in this art. Those people are really critical. Who in your world could support you? Would you need to get buy-in for this? That is a great example of agility, of thinking agility, moving across all four of those. I know this story really well because it was my dad I'm describing. And he moved from payoff to process, starting with possibilities and then down to people, and had to move back and forth. And in fact, what was interesting is that he accomplished this so much faster than he had thought that at a midpoint he suddenly said, you know what, I am so interested in the creative process, I'm going to actually do research on the brain. And it started a multiple decade focus on research on the brain, which still continues today. So we all have access to these different thinking modes. What's important is to understand where you like to play, because we have preferences for some over others. And you have to understand what that patterning is to be able to then be able to see where it is that you have to move. And so what I was working on, I just finished a book called The Whole Brain Business Book, and when I was looking, I thought, I wonder if there are people who do this more naturally. So we looked in our database, and we found over 9,000 CEOs in the last decade who had completed a thinking survey. And what we discovered is, as a single occupation, CEOs tend to have the most whole brain profile. They tend to be most mentally agile. Why do you think that is? Well, the work requires it. You have to be able to have that vision and see out into the future, to be able to build the business case and drive the results, to get the payoff. You have to put the processes in place to actually make things happen and get people on board so they can contribute and buy into the process. But when I went back and I looked at our HBDI database and I looked at over 2 million people that we have in there, it suddenly dawned on me, everybody could do this. You don't have to be a CEO to do this. We all need to be CEOs. We need to be CEOs of our own brain, CEOs of our own life. And in today's environment, that is critical. It's critical for you, and it's critical for those you lead. We're not just reacting, that we're actually moving forward. But step 2 is that you have to believe. Now, let me just ask you, how many of you believe that you can build your intellectual capability like a muscle? Raise your hand. How many of you believe that you can do that? Okay. How many of you think we're kind of have a fixed set of capabilities? Okay, most of you believe that we can build this. If you do believe, that means that you actually will be able to learn more easily. Carol Dweck's research on mindset shows us that that single belief will actually change our ability to learn. And the good news is that it also shows that you can change your mind. So even if you do believe that it's fixed, changing your mind will actually help you learn more effectively. So that belief is important. And once you believe, you can then start to retrain your brain. We're training our brains to be highly distractible with all these interruptions that we're setting up for ourselves every few minutes. Let me ask, how many of you multitask? Come on, confess. How many of you are multitasking right now? Okay. Now, we think we're more efficient, but in fact, it's interesting. We actually take 50% longer. The brain has to task switch. So it takes 50% longer to do both of those things that you're switching back and forth between. And you can have up to 50% more errors when you multitask. So I'm not asking you to not multitask. What I'm saying is give yourself some protected thinking time in the day where you're not doing that. Free your brain up to be agile by design, to be intentionally, deliberately thinking in the way you need to be thinking versus just reacting and having the world be the driver of how you're thinking every single day. Now, just that idea of taking a little bit of time, does that start to make, I see some people twitching in the audience, like, oh, put down technology. So part of what I recommend is a mind hack. I actually put thinking time on my calendar. Now, I have a colleague who said, well, you know what, I'm not going to call it thinking time because I'm not sure I want my boss to see that I'm doing it. Okay, I mean, I thought that was a little scary, but whatever you want to call it. Now, there's a danger here because you can put thinking time on your calendar and then still be walking around with technology all the time, just actually catching up on your email. And that happened to me when I first did it. So then I realized that I actually have to walk away from technology. And what I actually need to do is get up away from my desk, put down my phone. Whatever it takes for you. And start with whatever you can do. 15 minutes. There's some interesting research that with students that just showed that if they set their timer for 15 minutes, and this is really hard for students today, to stay away from technology for just a few minutes. Set their timer for 15 minutes, put their phones down so they can see their phones. They know it's not going anywhere. And they get 15 minutes of uninterrupted learning time, that their results were significantly better. Just 15 minutes. So start with whatever it is you can today. And that will make a difference. Now, some people say to me, well, you know, Ann, that's great. I block the thinking time, but there's still some of this thinking that I don't like to do. So I may not really be that agile. And we all have things that we hate to do. So think about the subject you hated most in school. What was that? Okay. Oh, it's interesting. Many of you are saying math. I think that's kind of interesting. I saw this T-shirt recently. Take a minute to think about it. 4 out of 3 people struggle with math. A little bit of a delayed response there. So when we look at what we don't like, that can be just as impactful in terms of our ability to be agile. Because if we're not going there mentally, then that's a problem. So I'd like to do a quick poll, and I'd like you to be thinking about what your greatest challenge or blind spot might be. So go to your app, if you would, the Lead 2015 app, and I want you to pick the one thing that is your greatest challenge or blind spot, if you could. One thing that's your biggest challenge or blind spot, if you could. Okay? All right. What is the number one thing for you? And we'll look and see what those results are. If we can put the results on the screen, that would be great. Okay. Can we see the results? I'm not seeing the results. There we go. Okay. So, all right. Interesting. Analysis. There we go. Fascinating. Analysis, goals, data, and money. Fascinating. 38%. Plans, detail, organization, 22. Communicate, relate, feel, 22. Ideas, future, big picture, 18. Okay, whatever it is, and isn't this interesting when we think about the profession that we're in and how the push for ROI is so important. That's kind of interesting that that's a challenge. Whatever that challenge might be, what you want to be doing is paying attention to it. Navigate beyond that blind spot. When I was finishing my book, I absolutely had to focus on the process and details. That's my blind spot. And put in place the systems and structures and timelines that would allow me to get it finished. Was it uncomfortable? You bet. Now, discomfort is a really interesting thing. It's actually a fascinating way to look at learning. So one of the things that as you look at your own thinking preferences and your blind spots, I want you to be thinking about is, okay, when do you get uncomfortable? I had an experience with a mentor. I was really frustrated some years ago, and I called him up and I said, God, Manny, I'm so frustrated with this leadership challenge. I don't know what to do. And he said, waited a minute, and he said, you know what, Ann? I am delighted to see how frustrated you are. I said, gee, thanks a lot. That's really helpful. I said, why? And he said, you know what? Because discomfort is a sign of learning. The fact that you're uncomfortable means that you're already engaging in a new learning process. You're already on the path. Remember when we were kids and we wanted to grow up really fast? And we had growing pains we needed to get through, but we were really interested in growing up. That notion of growing pains is a built-in part of the learning process. We need to understand and look for those signs of discomfort. We need to become more comfortable with discomfort. And, it's interesting as you think about those that we know and those moments in your life when you've been uncomfortable, just think about what you learned as part of that process. IBM is a great company. We've worked with IBM for many years with their leaders and managers, helping them apply whole brain thinking so that they can be more agile in their thinking. And the current CEO, Ginny Rometty, has a great quote about discomfort. She said, you know what? Comfort and growth do not coexist. If you're going to be growing, you've got to get uncomfortable. And throughout the course of her career, she actually selected roles that would help her become more uncomfortable so that she could be stretching her thinking, becoming uncomfortable. Are you uncomfortable enough? So, as you think about where it is that you need to be, you want to flipping that discomfort into learning. Think about it as a growth opportunity. Look for signs of that discomfort so that you can be more comfortable as part of what it is that you're doing, getting more comfortable with discomfort. So, as we look at the 4 steps that we've talked about, get to know this system. Pay attention to your thinking. Take time. You're here at a conference for 2 days. You have a great opportunity to pay attention to what's happening in your head. When do you shut down? When do you engage? When do you find yourself wanting to kind of escape mentally? When are you totally connected in? Pay attention to that. And then, as you're looking at that, you can begin to understand across the payoff, process, people, and possibilities where you tend to kind of like to live and what might be going on for you as you look at really resisting that retraining of your brain, right? And finding those little pockets of time where you're actually allowing your thinking to happen quite deliberately. You want to pay attention to those blind spots, which actually can get in your way and become a major obstacle to your ability to actually go beyond where you are today. Leverage those strengths, but work on those blind spots. It's one of the keys to your really becoming the CEO of your own brain and your own life. And chances are you're going to feel discomfort along the way. So pay attention to that discomfort. Look for it. It's a sign that you're learning. Now, you might say, well, this is interesting, and you've got these steps. What do I do to get started? And I had a great learning from my dad, and he said, you know, when I go into the studio at night and I finish a painting, I'd feel great about finishing that painting. But then it's like, oh my God, I've got to start the next one. How do I make sure I start the next one? And so his mind hack was to take a blank canvas and put it out and actually commit to the next painting with a sketch or even a brush stroke. What will your brush stroke be? It's a choice. It's a choice you have. Now, if you decide not to, you can stay with your patterns and you can choose to not grow, but you might meet the fate of the dinosaurs, as you see in this little cartoon. Oh, crap, was that today? As Darwin said, the species that will survive is not the strongest, like the dinosaurs, but the one that is most adaptive to change. Will you devote 3 more months of this year to just doing email? Is that the choice that you're making? Or can you take some percentage of that time to help yourself begin to see where it is you want to be in the future and to create cultures in your organizations that allow people to do that allow people to actually engage what it is that you hired them to do? Thousands of people around the globe are getting better results by applying this notion of deliberate whole brain thinking. And I think as you look at yourself first, and those that you lead and those that you work with, how can you become the CEO of your own brain, of your own life? If you think deliberately, you will live deliberately. And you might just surprise yourself about what you can do. My dad certainly did. Good luck, and thank you.